No woman had ever lasted more than a day with Caleb Thorne, the feared mountain man of Iron Ridge, whose very presence sent settlers fleeing back down the treacherous Wyoming peaks. But when Ruth Yoder, a cast-out Amish woman with nothing left to lose, climbed his mountain in 1859, she brought something no other woman had ever possessed: a heart large enough to stand where others fell, and strong enough to love where others feared to tread. Could the woman everyone called too much finally be exactly what the untamable mountain man needed? The scream cut through the Wyoming wilderness like a knife through butter. Martha Sullivan stumbled down the Rocky Mountain path, her wedding dress torn and muddy, tears streaming down her face. Behind her, the dark peak of Iron Ridge loomed like a giant's fist against the gray sky of 1859. "He's a monster," she sobbed to the crowd gathered at Willow Creek Trading Post. "Those eyes, cold as winter ice. I couldn't even stay for supper." Old Pete Jenkins spat into the dirt and shook his head. "That makes 17 this year alone. 17 women who thought they could tame Caleb Thorne." He pointed his gnarled finger toward the mountain where smoke curled from a lonely cabin. "Ain't no woman born who can last a day with that devil." The mountain man's reputation spread like wildfire across the territory. Some said he could track a mouse through a thunderstorm. Others whispered he'd killed 20 men with his bare hands. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts when his name was mentioned. Up on his rocky ledge, Caleb watched the latest reject flee his domain. His weathered hands gripped his rifle as he studied the valley below. Wagon trains came and went like autumn leaves, carrying hopeful families west toward dreams of gold and land. But none ever stopped at his mountain anymore. The wind howled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of coming snow. Winter would arrive soon, and with it, the crushing loneliness that made strong men weep. Caleb had learned to live with silence, but sometimes the quiet felt heavier than boulders. His cabin sat empty except for dust and shadows. No warm meals waited on his table. No gentle voice called his name. The other mountain men had wives now, children, laughter echoing from their homes. But Caleb remained alone, feared by all who knew his name. Down at the trading post, travelers shared stories around the fire. They spoke of the strange hermit who lived like a wild animal, who growled instead of speaking, who sent women running before sunset. Some claimed he ate raw meat with his hands. Others said he never bathed or cut his hair. But none of them knew the truth about Caleb Thorne's past. None understood why he'd chosen this lonely mountain prison. And none suspected that somewhere in the distant valleys, a woman unlike any other was already walking toward his domain. The moon rose full and bright over Iron Ridge, casting long shadows across the wilderness. In 12 hours, everything would change forever. But tonight, Caleb sat alone by his dying fire, unaware that his salvation wore a plain gray dress and carried a worn leather Bible. "You planning to die up there, miss?" The voice belonged to a skinny boy loading supplies onto a mule. Ruth Yoder adjusted her heavy pack and smiled at his concern. She'd been walking for 3 days, following the winding trail that led to Iron Ridge. Her feet ached, but her determination burned stronger than ever. "I am going to live," she replied, in her careful English, touched with the accent of Pennsylvania Dutch country, perhaps for the first time. The boy's eyes widened as he took in her appearance. Ruth stood tall and solid, her body built for hard work rather than fancy dresses. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her round face showed the marks of 30 years spent outdoors. She was nothing like the delicate flowers who usually attempted this journey. "But ma'am, that's Caleb Thorne's mountain. He ain't normal." Ruth shifted her bundle and began walking again. Behind her lay the Amish settlement that had been her home, the community that had finally decided she was too much trouble to keep. Too many questions about their rules, too much independence for a woman, too large for any man to want as a wife. "Normal is overrated," she said softly. The trail grew steeper as afternoon faded into evening. Ruth's legs burned with each step, but she'd endured worse, during harvest seasons back home. Her mind wandered to the letter that had brought her here, a desperate advertisement from a lonely mountain man seeking a wife. Most women had laughed at such foolishness. Ruth had seen it as God's answer to her prayers. As darkness fell, she reached the final ridge. Below her stretched a valley dotted with flickering campfires. Above her, a single light glowed from a cabin perched on the mountainside like an eagle's nest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but not from fear. For the first time in years, she felt hope. The climb to Caleb's door took another hour. Ruth's breathing came hard in the thin mountain air, but she never once considered turning back. When she finally reached the cabin, she found a man standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light inside. He was bigger than she'd expected, with shoulders broad enough to carry the world. His dark hair hung past his collar, and his face bore the lines of someone who'd seen too much of life's harder truths. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Not the cold, cruel orbs Martha Sullivan had described, but deep pools of loneliness that matched her own. "You're lost," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but not unkind. "No," Ruth replied, setting down her heavy pack. "I am exactly where I need to be." They stared at each other across the small porch, two outcasts meeting at the edge of the world. Neither spoke for a long moment, but something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Ruth had spent her life being told she was too much. This man had spent his being told he was too dangerous. "I've come to be your wife," she said simply. What would happen when two people, who'd never fit anywhere else, finally found each other? The smell of fresh bread filled the cabin like sunshine after a storm. Ruth had been living on Iron Ridge for 3 weeks now, and every morning brought something new that surprised Caleb. Today, she hummed while she worked, a sound he hadn't heard in his home for years. "You don't have to do all this," Caleb said, watching her strong hands knead dough on his rough wooden table. Her sleeves were rolled up, showing arms that could handle hard work without complaint. "I want to," Ruth replied simply. Her blue eyes met his across the small room. This is what a home should feel like. Home. The word hit Caleb like a punch to the chest. He'd forgotten what that meant, until Ruth arrived with her quiet ways and gentle smile. But Ruth was fighting her own battles inside. Every night, she lay awake wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. The people back in Pennsylvania had called her too big, too stubborn, too different. What if Caleb thought the same thing? What if he was just being kind until he found a way to send her away? "Why do you live up here all alone?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. The flames danced across his weathered face, making him look younger somehow. Caleb's jaw tightened. "People don't much like my company." "What people?" "All people." He stood up quickly, walking to the window. "You should know that about me, Ruth. I'm not a good man." Ruth set down her mending and looked at his broad back. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched into fists. "What makes a man good or bad?" she asked softly. "Actions, choices." His voice was rough as sandpaper. "Things you can't take back." "Then why did you take me in? Why did you let me stay?" Caleb turned around, and Ruth saw something raw and painful in his dark eyes. "Because you looked at me like I might be worth saving." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Ruth felt her heart beating fast. This mountain man, this fierce and frightening person everyone feared, was just a lonely soul, carrying too much pain. "Maybe we can save each other," she whispered. That night, Ruth found wildflowers growing near the cabin and put them in a jar on the table. Caleb stared at them for a long time, as if he'd never seen anything so beautiful. "My mother used to pick flowers," he said quietly. "Before she died. Before everything went wrong." Ruth reached across the table and covered his scarred hand with her soft one. "Tell me about her." And slowly, like ice melting in spring, Caleb began to talk. He told her about growing up poor, about watching his mother work herself to death trying to keep food on the table. He told her about the anger that had grown inside him like poison, about the choices he'd made when that anger took control. Ruth listened without judgment, her thumb rubbing gentle circles on his knuckles. She didn't pull away when he told her about the fights, the violence, the years of running from town to town. Instead, she held his hand tighter. "You're not that person anymore," she said when he finished. "How can you be sure?" "Because that person wouldn't have let me stay. That person wouldn't care about wildflowers on the table." Ruth smiled, and it lit up her whole face. "That person wouldn't be afraid of hurting me by telling the truth." For the first time since she'd arrived, Caleb smiled back. It was small and uncertain, but it was real. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, but inside the cabin, something warmer than fire was beginning to grow. Thunder rolled across Iron Ridge like an angry giant's footsteps. But it wasn't the storm that made Ruth's hands shake as she peeled potatoes. Through the small window, she could see 3 men on horseback climbing the narrow path toward their cabin. Caleb stood frozen by the door, his face white as winter snow. "Who are they?" Ruth asked, though the cold fear in Caleb's eyes already told her these weren't friendly visitors. "Trouble," he said, reaching for his rifle. "The kind that follows a man no matter how far he runs." The lead rider was tall and thin like a scarecrow, with a scar running from his left ear to his mouth. He sat his horse like he owned the world, and his smile was colder than mountain wind. The 2 men behind him looked like they'd rather shoot than talk. "Caleb Thorne!" the scarred man called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Been looking for you for a mighty long time, old friend." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She'd never seen Caleb afraid before, but now his hands trembled as he checked his weapon. Whatever these men wanted, it was bad enough to shake a mountain man who feared nothing. "Garrison," Caleb said through gritted teeth. "Thought you might be dead by now." "Not quite." Garrison's laugh was like nails on wood. "Though you tried hard enough to make it happen when you ran off with our money." "Money?" Ruth's mind raced. What money? What had Caleb done before she found him on this mountain? "That was 5 years ago," Caleb said. "Ancient history. $15,000 don't become history just because you want it to." Garrison swung down from his horse, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. "Plus interest. Plus the trouble you caused me. I figure you owe me about $30,000 now." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. $30,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. How could Caleb possibly have stolen that much? "I don't have it," Caleb said. "Then you'll work it off." Garrison's eyes moved to Ruth, and she felt dirty just from his stare. "Or maybe we can work out a different arrangement." The way he looked at her made Ruth want to hide, but she forced herself to stand tall. She hadn't come to this mountain to cower from anyone. "My wife's not part of this." Caleb's voice was dangerous now, like a wolf protecting its den. "Wife?" Garrison laughed again. "You always did have strange tastes, Caleb. But business is business." Ruth watched the 3 men spread out around the cabin like hunters surrounding prey. Her mind worked fast, the way it had when she was young and had to protect herself from bullies who made fun of her size. "What kind of business?" she asked, stepping forward. Caleb shot her a sharp look. "Ruth, stay inside." "I asked a question," she said firmly. "What business?" Garrison's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a grin. "Your husband used to be my partner. We took things that didn't belong to us. Trains, banks, rich folks who had more than they needed." The words hit Ruth like cold water. Caleb had been an outlaw, a robber, maybe worse. "And then he got himself a conscience," Garrison continued. "Decided he didn't want to play anymore. Took our last score and disappeared." Ruth looked at Caleb, seeing him differently now. The careful way he moved, the scars on his hands, the reason he lived alone where no one could find him, it all made terrible sense. "So you see, Mrs. Thorne," Garrison said, "your husband owes me. One way or another, I'm collecting today." The storm broke overhead with a crash of thunder that shook the cabin walls. Rain began falling in heavy drops, turning the dust to mud. But the real storm was just beginning. "Caleb," Ruth said quietly, "is it true?" His dark eyes met hers across the small space, and she saw the answer there: pain, shame, and fear all mixed together in a look that broke her heart. "Yes," he whispered. Ruth felt the ground shift under her feet like an earthquake. Everything she thought she knew about this man, about their life together, about her future, all of it crumbled like sand. But as she stood there in the growing darkness, watching three dangerous men close in on the only home she'd known in years, Ruth made a choice that surprised even herself. She stepped closer to Caleb, not away from him. "Then we'll face it together," she said. Thunder crashed overhead as three riders appeared through the morning mist like demons from hell itself. Ruth dropped her laundry basket, watching Caleb's face turn white as fresh snow. These weren't traitors or lost travelers. These men rode with purpose, their eyes cold as winter stones. "Well, well," called the leader, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Caleb Thorne, living high on the mountain, like some kind of king." The man's face bore a twisted scar from ear to chin, and his smile promised nothing but trouble. "Been looking for you a long time, partner." Ruth pressed herself against the cabin wall, her heart beating like a trapped bird. Through the window, she watched Caleb step onto the porch, his rifle ready but not raised. Something about these men made her stomach twist with fear she'd never felt before. "Garrison," Caleb said, his voice steady but tight. "Thought you were dead." "Takes more than a cavalry charge to kill me," Garrison spat into the dirt, never taking his eyes off Caleb. "You cost me everything when you ran off like a yellow dog. $15,000 in gold. Gone because you grew soft." The other two men spread out like wolves circling a deer. Ruth could see their hands hovering near their guns, fingers twitching with eagerness. Her mind raced. 3 against 1 wasn't fair odds, especially when Caleb looked like he'd rather run than fight. "That was 5 years ago," Caleb replied. "I'm not that man anymore." "No? Then prove it." Garrison's laugh sounded like breaking glass. "Send that fat woman inside and ride with us again. One last job, and we'll call it even." Ruth's blood boiled at his words, but fear kept her frozen. She watched Caleb's shoulders tense, saw his knuckles go white around his rifle. For a terrible moment, she wondered if he might actually consider it, if saving his own skin mattered more than protecting her. Then everything exploded at once. Garrison drew his pistol with lightning speed, but Caleb was faster. The rifle crack echoed off the canyon walls as the scarred man tumbled from his saddle. The other two scattered for cover, firing wild shots that splintered wood around the cabin. But Ruth wasn't hiding anymore. While the men focused on Caleb, she slipped out the back door, her heavy skirts silent on the pine needles. Her late father had taught her that sometimes the best weapon was surprise, and these men had made a fatal mistake. They'd forgotten about her. The first gunman crouched behind a fallen log, taking careful aim at Caleb's position. He never saw Ruth coming until her cast-iron skillet connected with his skull like a bell. He dropped like a sack of grain, his gun flying into the bushes. "Gott, I am Himmel," she shouted, surprising herself with the fury in her voice. "You dare threaten my husband on his own land?" The last man spun toward her, his eyes wide with shock. In that split second of confusion, Caleb's rifle spoke again. The mountain fell silent except for the ringing echoes and Ruth's heavy breathing. Smoke drifted between the pines as Ruth stood over the unconscious gunman, her skillet still raised. Her hands shook, but not from fear, from something powerful and protective she'd never felt before. She looked at Caleb across the clearing, seeing him with new eyes. He wasn't just a mountain hermit anymore. He was a man with secrets, and those secrets had just tried to kill them both. Darkness wrapped around the cabin like a heavy blanket, but neither Ruth nor Caleb could sleep. They sat by the dying fire, the silence between them thick as morning fog. The bodies lay covered outside, waiting for dawn and burial, while questions hung in the air like smoke. Ruth's hands still trembled as she poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The simple act felt strange after the violence of the afternoon. How could she return to normal tasks when everything had changed? She studied Caleb's face in the firelight, seeing lines of worry and shame she'd never noticed before. "You're wondering who I really am," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know who you are." Ruth set down her cup with careful precision. "You're the man who chops my firewood every morning, who built me shelves for my preserves, who holds me when the winter storms get too fierce." Caleb shook his head, running his hands through his dark hair. "That's who I became. But before," he stared into the flames, as if they might burn away his past. "Before I met you, I was someone else entirely. Someone you wouldn't recognize." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny prayers. Ruth waited, understanding that some stories couldn't be rushed. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, its voice lonely and wild. "Garrison and I ran together for 3 years, Caleb continued. "We robbed trains, stagecoaches, banks, took whatever we wanted, and killed anyone who got in our way." His voice grew thick with old guilt. "I was good at it, Ruth. Too good. They called me the Iron Ridge Ghost because I could track anyone, anywhere." Ruth's coffee grew cold in her hands, but she didn't move. She thought of her gentle husband, the man who wouldn't harm a spider, and tried to picture him with blood on his hands. The image wouldn't come, or maybe she wouldn't let it. "The last job went wrong," Caleb said. "We hit a train outside Cheyenne, but there were families aboard. Children." His hands clenched into fists. "Garrison wanted to make sure there were no witnesses. All of them, even the little ones." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. "What did you do?" "I stopped him, shot his gun right out of his hand, and told him we were done." Caleb looked up at her then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "But the damage was already done. People were hurt because of me. Innocent people. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross." Ruth thought of her own journey, cast out by her people for being different, judged for her size and stubborn spirit. Everyone carried scars, she realized. Some just showed more than others. "So you came here," she said softly. "To hide, to disappear, to become someone new." Caleb's laugh held no humor. "But you can't outrun your past forever. It always catches up." Ruth stood slowly, her bones creaking from the day's stress. She walked to the window and looked out at the star-filled sky, thinking of all the nights she'd prayed for God to show her where she belonged. Maybe this was her answer, not just finding a place to be accepted, but becoming strong enough to accept others, flaws and all. "My people taught me about forgiveness," she said, her back still turned to him. "They said God's mercy was bigger than any sin, but they forgot to show mercy to each other." She turned around, her face calm in the firelight. "I won't make that mistake." Caleb stared at her, as if seeing a stranger. "Ruth, you don't understand. I've killed men, stolen from families. There's blood on my hands that will never wash clean." "Then it's a good thing," she said, moving toward him with quiet determination. "That I love you for who you are now, not who you used to be." Thunder crashed overhead as Caleb threw another log onto the fire. The storm had been raging for 3 days, trapping him and Ruth inside their cabin like caged animals. But the real storm wasn't outside, it was brewing between them. "We can't keep pretending this will work forever," Caleb muttered, pacing near the window. His boots clicked against the wooden floor with each angry step. Outside, rain hammered the roof like bullets. Ruth looked up from her sewing, her needle frozen mid-stitch. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about." He spun around, his eyes wild with fear, disguised as anger. "People are starting to ask questions down at the trading post. Sheriff Morrison rode up here twice last month, sniffing around." The fabric slipped from Ruth's hands. She had seen the lawmen too, watching their cabin through a spyglass from the valley below. Her stomach had twisted into knots each time. "So we tell them the truth," she said quietly. "The truth?" Caleb laughed. But there was no humor in it. The truth is that I'm a killer with blood on my hands. The truth is that you're harboring a criminal. The truth is that we're both living a lie." Ruth stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. "The truth is that you're a different man now." "Am I?" He grabbed his old gun belt from the peg by the door, the leather worn smooth from years of use. "When Garrison's men came, I killed them without hesitation. Same as always. Same as the old days. You killed them to protect us. I killed them because it's what I do." He strapped on the belt, his hands shaking slightly. "It's all I've ever been good at." Ruth watched him with growing alarm. She had seen this look before in her father's eyes, when the bank threatened to take their farm, in her brother's face, when he decided to leave the Amish community forever. It was the look of a man preparing to run. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To turn myself in." He reached for his coat. "Sheriff Morrison can take me back to Colorado Territory. They've got a nice jail cell waiting for me there." "No." The word came out sharper than Ruth intended. She moved between Caleb and the door, her solid frame blocking his path. "I won't let you do this. You can't stop me. Watch me try." They stared at each other across the small cabin, the fire crackling between them like the tension in the air. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the mountains in harsh white light. "Don't you understand?" Caleb's voice broke slightly. "I'm trying to save you. If I leave now, you can tell everyone I forced you to stay. You can go back to civilization. Find a good man." "I found my good man." Ruth stepped closer, her blue eyes blazing. "He's standing right here, too scared to believe he deserves happiness." "I don't deserve you. That's not your choice to make." She reached for his hands, pulling them away from his gun belt. "I decided you were worth loving the day I climbed this mountain. Nothing has changed. But everything had changed, and they both knew it. The world below was closing in, and their peaceful life was balanced on the edge of a knife. What would happen when the past finally caught up with them for good? Morning came soft and golden to Iron Ridge, painting the peaks in shades of honey and rose. 5 years had passed since that stormy night when Caleb almost ran. Now their cabin had grown into a proper house, with glass windows that caught the sunrise, and a wraparound porch where children could play. Ruth hummed as she kneaded bread dough, her hands strong and sure in their rhythm. Through the kitchen window, she could see Caleb teaching their 4-year-old son David how to chop kindling. The boy's small hands struggled with the hatchet, but his father's patient voice guided him through each careful motion. "Mama, when will baby sister wake up?" Their 2-year-old daughter Mary tugged at Ruth's apron, her dark curls bouncing with each hop. "Soon, little dove, soon." Ruth smiled down at her daughter, whose eyes held the same fierce independence that had once gotten Ruth cast out from her Amish community. But here, in their mountain home, that fire was welcomed and nurtured. A knock at the door made them all freeze. Visitors were rare on Iron Ridge, and unexpected ones usually meant trouble. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his face alert but calm. "I'll get it," he said. But Ruth was already wiping flour from her hands. "We'll get it together." They opened the door to find Sheriff Morrison standing on their porch, hat in hand. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a tall woman in a black dress, her severe face softened by curious eyes. "Morning, folks," Morrison said. "This here is Judge Catherine Wells from the Territorial Court. She's got some questions about your past, Caleb." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs, but Caleb simply nodded. "I figured this day would come eventually." "May we come in?" the judge asked. Her voice was gentler than Ruth had expected. They sat around the kitchen table, while the children played quietly in the corner. Judge Wells opened a leather portfolio and spread several papers across the wooden surface. "I've been investigating the Garrison gang for 2 years, she began. "Bank robberies, train holdups, murder. Your name came up in connection with them." "It would," Caleb said simply. "I rode with them for 3 years before I came here." Ruth reached for his hand under the table, her fingers intertwining with his. "What I found interesting," the judge continued, "was what happened after you left. The gang got more violent, more reckless, as if someone who had been holding them back was gone. She pulled out a newspaper clipping. This article talks about how you warned the bank in Silver Creek about Garrison's planned robbery, saved 17 people from being killed. Caleb's eyes widened. He had forgotten about that anonymous letter he'd sent. And this testimony from a train conductor says, a former gang member helped passengers escape before a robbery in 1861. Judge Wells looked directly at Caleb. That was you too, wasn't it? I just couldn't let innocent people get hurt anymore. Judge Wells nodded and gathered her papers. Mr. Thorne, the territorial government is prepared to offer you a full pardon in exchange for your testimony against the remaining Garrison gang members. Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes. A pardon? After all these years of looking over their shoulders, of fearing every knock at the door, they could finally be truly free. What do you say? The judge asked. Caleb looked around their home at the bread rising on the counter, at his children playing with wooden toys he'd carved, at his wife whose courage had saved them all. I say yes, he answered. We're not running anymore. As the officials left, Ruth and Caleb stood on their porch, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. Their children ran in circles around them, laughing and free. Do you ever regret it? Caleb asked quietly. Giving up your old life for this one? Ruth smiled, one hand resting on her growing belly where their third child waited to be born. My old life was about making myself smaller to fit in. This life is about becoming exactly who I was meant to be. The wind that had once howled lonely through Iron Ridge now sang a song of belonging, carrying their story across the peaks to anyone brave enough to listen.